This episode is brought to you by Pepsi Wild Cherry. Pepsi Wild Cherry is bursting with delicious cherry flavor and a sweet, crisp taste that gives you more to go wild for. Getting wild may look different these days, but whether it's opting for a solo Friday binge watch or a big night out, everyone can indulge in their wild side with Pepsi Wild Cherry. Also available in zero sugar. So grab a Pepsi Wild Cherry and get wild.
I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access.
4 decades as Kentucky beat reporter means that Jerry Tipton knows where all the bones are buried when it comes to the Wildcats. And that means he's always welcomed on Press Box Access. Jerry makes a return visit to our show to talk about his new book, Deja Blue, a sports writer reflects on 41 seasons of Kentucky basketball. In the book, Jerry shares some great stories about covering the Cats, just as he shared with us in our first episode with him in 2022. Make sure to check that out. Now we'll hear some more tales from Jerry. Once again, he takes us behind the Big Blue scenes, same as he did with his relentless reporting from 1981 until his retirement in 2022. Jerry's objectivity didn't always make him popular with Kentucky fans, but his journalistic integrity is well respected in the sports writing community. Tipton's a legend, a Hall of Famer. We're lucky to hear from him again. Jerry, welcome back to Press Box Access. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, it seems like only yesterday I was with you.
Yeah, it seems that way. It was actually a couple years ago. We had a great time taping an episode for this show in the summer of 2022, shortly after your retirement. And now here you are back in our tavern. Do I owe you beers or something? I thought I paid that last round.
Well, I think a glass of wine and we're even.
Oh, a glass of wine. I forgot. You're a little artier than I am. I'm just kidding. You don't owe me anything. Actually, I owe you a lot, Jerry, since we first met 38 years ago in 1986. Think about that. I was just a kid at the Kentucky Colonel, the student newspaper at the University of Kentucky, where I graduated from. And you were an important mentor to me then and have been a great friend ever since. And I'm thrilled to have you back on the show, especially to talk about your new book, Deja Blue, a sports writer reflects on 41 seasons of Kentucky basketball. I think it's coming out in April. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it was, it was something that I thought about a little, a memoir. And, there was a lot of anxiety because I'd never written a book, and it's a lot longer, obviously, than a newspaper story. And I would have some anxiety with a newspaper story, but this was like a whole new world. And can I do this? And then I thought, well, 41 years, there's a lot of memories. And okay, I think I can do it. Then the anxiety was, well, then how do I do it? How do I organize it? And
then it's work.
Yeah, it was, I'm not kidding about anxiety. And I won't say sleepless nights, but interrupted sleep as I tried.
Wait a minute, this is how you spend retirement, battling anxiety?
Well, it was
Come on, Jerry.
For this one thing, yes. And the rest of it has been fairly calm. And it was time. I felt very lucky to be covering some. I think any reporter wants to cover something that the readers or the listeners or the viewers are really interested in. And as you know, Kentucky fans are interested. 365 days a year.
Oh, yes.
So, and 366 this year, I suppose. I mean, as you know, Kentucky basketball, there's a lot of events. I mean, it's seldom boring. Even, every double dribble is a possible controversy.
Right.
So, yeah. So, it was always, you were always engaged. And, it was fun to revisit that in a way. I felt lucky to be covering something like that the whole time. And, it was fun in a way and challenging to kind of go back over that.
And sort through. Think about it. 1,200 games, 3 national championship teams, 9 Final Fours,
Right.
6 coaches from Joe Hall to John Calipari. By the way, do you have those coaches? Do you have their heads mounted above your fireplace at home?
That's a straight line if I ever heard one. But I'm just going to pass on that. But yeah,
Okay.
the good thing about it is that every time there's a coaching change, it's almost starting a new beat.
Right.
So it's kind of refreshing in a way to a coaching change. I hated the process, though, of finding the coach. And, there's a lot of tension and pressure. But once a new coach was named, then it's like you're starting over and it's a refreshing situation.
Well, you were able to look back on your career in a refreshing way, now 2 years removed. But when you think about covering that, do you look at it any differently now than when you were in the heat of the day-to-day journalistic battle of trying to cover something as big as Kentucky basketball?
Well, the best thing about it was every so often you felt like you were witnessing history. And like the cliche goes, you're writing the first draft of history. And that was nice. But, I felt like I had a good long run, 41 seasons. And, Ben Roberts is the new beat person. He's in his second season.
Right.
And he does a really good job. And so that makes me feel good. And we get along. So that's helpful too, I think. And, every once in a while he might say something, but I'm thinking about working on this story. And there might be a moment of envy, like, ooh, that's an interesting idea. That would be fun to try to put together a story on. But for the most part, for almost totally, I had a good long run. I'm very lucky, I thought, and grateful to be covering something like Kentucky. So all good.
Your job really was to answer the questions of people who didn't get to go there. And yet sometimes they didn't always agree with you, right, Jerry?
Yes. I mean, somehow I got a reputation for asking hard questions. And I did a chapter on that in the memoir. And I wasn't trying to ask hard questions, quote unquote. I was just trying to ask good questions. And it wasn't unusual for me to kind of put myself, or try to, in the mind of the reader. And as the story, you're interviewing and so on, and also thinking about the story. And you would think, well, if I'm reading this, I'd want to know X. That's why that was the motivation. It wasn't to try to press somebody into a corner.
Right. Do you think was there a story that touched a nerve more than any because you asked that hard question?
Well, I know the one that the most famous one was the one with John Calipari. It was in October, and I think I was asking about they had a player who wasn't eligible yet, and so the question was the question I asked was, would this be like, I think John Wall had to sit out 2 games and then he was fine, or is it more like Enes Kanter, who had to sit out the whole season and then turned pro. So he never played for Kentucky. So I asked, which one is the example you think this one's going to follow? Well, John Calipari, maybe he didn't like the idea of it, of bringing up past players who had eligibility issues. So he basically scolded me. He had a scolding tone to his voice and told me I shouldn't ask that. I had no right to ask that question, was the gist of what he was saying. And I was, all I said was, well, this, I have every right to ask the question. You don't have to answer, but I have the right to ask the question. After all, this is media day, not coach's day.
That's right.
That was a memorable thing that kind of became associated with me. And,
You should have trademarked it. It's media day, just kind of like Pat Riley did with Three-Peat.
Well, he had done that a few years earlier at a media day where he had told me I shouldn't ask that. I didn't have the right to ask that question. And so that stuck in my mind. And so when it happened again, I had kind of thought it through, and that was going to be the punchline.
He must have thought you were like employed by Pravda.
I was just, again, I'm just trying to cover, I'm thinking of the reader and, trying to write a good story. That was the gist of it. It wasn't to pin somebody into a corner.
Right.
But the coaches have a different agenda.
Right.
And then the media does. And that's become more and more apparent over time, over my time.
How has that changed, Jerry? How did you generally get along with the coaches, say, back to Joe Hall and then through Eddie Sutton and Rick Pitino and on Tubby and on and on? How did that change? They knew what your job was, but they had the leverage of, the fan base behind them.
Right. And they could, withdraw access or not, they had ways of getting back at you. And back in the day with Joe B and Eddie Sutton, especially back in the 80s, the media was more a part of the program. You could go to every practice or almost every practice you wanted to. And with Joe B, and I think with Eddie some, but definitely with Joe B, I would, if they were playing an afternoon game on the road, I would go with the team on the team plane and then get back, late afternoon. And then I had plenty of time to go to the office and write my stories. The deadlines were a lot better back then, I would say. It was like 10 at night, something like that. So I had plenty of time to get done. Now, nowadays and more recently, you're almost on a constant deadline. So there was no time to get on a plane and fly back before you did your story.
Right.
So you just had more access. You got to know each other better back then. Now it's much more, in my latter years, it became more of a, you only got the coach when he wanted you to have him, when he had something he wanted to get across, that he had an agenda, it seemed like.
Yeah, I remember even as a student reporter in the 80s, one time I called Dale Brown's office and he answered the phone.
Wow.
And he talked to me. And I remember just being in awe of the fact that, wait a minute, we can just walk into Rupp Arena and watch practice. Again, as growing up as a kid who followed Kentucky basketball, all of a sudden you're there. And that taught me a lot about how to be a journalist and not a fan. And that access was really like eye-opening to me. How did that access help you do your job then?
Well, I think it helped in the sense of getting to know each other. And so, hopefully you could get across that you were just trying to do your job. You weren't against Kentucky or trying to prevent the team from winning. I remember one Thanksgiving when Eddie Sutton was coach, they practiced 3 times that day. And
Three?
Yeah.
3. Happy Thanksgiving, boys.
And I went to all 3 because, I wasn't married then. I didn't have family in Lexington. So I had nothing to do. I went.
That's a sad indictment, Jerry. I don't know if it's a tribute to your journalistic tenacity or a sad indictment on your life.
Yeah, you make a good point. But I went to all 3, and maybe you could get across, that you were interested, that you were trying to do a good job. Maybe that would be helpful in a sense.
Well, you mentioned Eddie, and Eddie was the coach when I was there as a student reporter. And when I think about the passion of the fans and how important it is to the state of Kentucky, I think about my senior year in the spring of '88 when the Emory package opened and Chris Mills, the recruit, all of a sudden it's alleged that he had money sent to him and this huge NCAA scandal breaks out.
Right.
You're the beat reporter, you're the basketball reporter, and now you've got this 4-alarm fire breaking out. What was that like to cover a scandal like that? When you're really, I'm here to cover basketball, but all of a sudden this huge news happens.
Well, it was not much fun. And there was a lot of pressure because, you could get scooped and so on. People are not in a good mood. And so, there's not that collegiality, if that's the right word, that there could be in better times. The one thing I remember about that is Eddie Sutton was available kind of every day. And of course, there were pointed questions, quote unquote, hard questions to ask. And you did. And there were several games, away games, that I didn't go to because the thought was that something might break with that story. And I'd better be here. I better be working on that rather than basketball. And so other people, the paper sent other people to the away games. I went to some, but there were some I missed. It was just a different world.
What was Eddie like to deal with during that time?
He was remarkably good. Is that the way I remember it was he wasn't happy, obviously. No one's happy in that situation, but I don't remember him taking it out on the media. I don't remember it. And, he seemed to acknowledge that you had to ask about it.
Right.
And he had to respond to it. And so we played that game, so to speak.
Well, speaking of response, I was there in Memorial Coliseum in the hallway. I had just graduated. A story had just broken in the LA Daily News about the package. And Eddie is in his office. He's working on his first response to the story. And I happened to be in the hallway, and I was hanging out with Mike Embry from the Associated Press and Brian Malloy from UPI. And you could see into Eddie's office. He's back there, and he had I think it was like a booster guy with the big cowboy hat on. And he's back there, and his secretary said he's going to have a statement a little bit. And at one point, while we were waiting in the hallway, Eddie come walking out to use the restroom down the hall. And when he came back, he said to me and Mike and Brian, "Do any of you boys have a dictionary? I need to look up the word absolve."
That's a wonderful story. It's a great story. And that kind of, when you were telling that, I was thinking that back in the day, you could walk into the coaches' offices, and if he was free, you could just walk in.
Yeah, exactly.
It's much more informal. Now it's much more structured, and you only get the coach in certain situations in certain ways for the most part.
Yeah. I also remember Eddie showing up in practice in that full fur-length coat.
He had, he was like against the eight ball almost from the beginning. I remember one of and as you know, Todd, the Kentucky fans, it's not hard to displease them. And he didn't move soon enough, as I recall. He didn't have a home, you know what I mean? He was unsettled. And so
when he first took the job, you talked about moving from Arkansas.
Right.
Okay.
And so the fans complained about that. And, it's almost always something that they're not happy about.
Well, one thing that didn't change is at that time, the attention was such that this was only a couple years after the Herald Leader and the Pulitzer and the investigation. And there was a bomb threat on the newspaper office. And so the passion was definitely there. So when Eddie was looking to absolve himself, it was totally understandable.
Yeah, there was also during that Pulitzer Prize period, what was said to be a bullet hole in one of the windows. Yeah.
Really?
Now, I don't know if it really was a bullet hole or not. I don't know. But there was a hole that you could imagine about the size of a bullet going through the window.
Wow.
And I think about today, where
wow. Scary.
Yeah, where there's mass shootings and all that stuff. That would be interesting to see how that would play out nowadays.
Well, Eddie, took the bullet and was moved aside. Dwayne Casey really took the bullet and got the blame.
Right.
and then scandal leads to NCAA sanctions. And then the third coach who covered comes in, Rick Pitino, who resurrected what he called the Roman Empire and the famous Sports Illustrated cover, Kentucky's Shame.
Right.
And made all things right. But really, he almost didn't get hired because of your great reporting work. I know in the spring of '89 when Rick was in town to interview, you had dug up an NCAA case file about his time as an assistant at Hawaii when they committed some NCAA investigations. And then you had to go approach him, right? At dinner or something?
Yeah, at the Coach House, kind of a famous restaurant in Lexington. And somehow I found out that that was his first coaching job, I think, as an assistant was at Hawaii. And somehow I found out that there was NCAA trouble and that he was part of it. So I got in touch with the University of Hawaii, and they sent me documents. And I was hoping that it was next to nothing and, we just kind of move on. Well, I read it and like, oh, no, this is not a little thing. There were multiple violations alleged and so on. So you obviously you have, and I wasn't going to do anything with it until he became a serious candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe, I don't know if that's the right thing or not, but I put it in my desk hoping I wouldn't have to see those documents again. But then he becomes a serious candidate and he's coming into interviews. So I felt like I've got to do this. And I did. I got him at a restaurant and I found out they were going to, the AD,
C.M. Newton.
C.M. Newton was going to be taking him to dinner. So I got them outside in where not in the restaurant itself, but in the area just outside it, and asked him about it and asked CM and then did the story. And, I write about it in the memoir, and they decided to look past it. And that first year was, I remember that was when you asked about, were there things you learned? I'd forgotten in that story that I talked to the University of Hawaii coach.
Mm.
And he kind of explained it was the first job, and he didn't excuse it, but he didn't. He said, he kind of said, you just look on past it. These things happen,
right?
And so anyway, that's what happened, and I wrote about it. And as you know, that first Pitino year was amazing. It was the most unusual Kentucky season in my 41. Because it was more about fun, and the fans loved the style of play,
right?
Running, shooting threes, pressing, constant action, and the fans loved it. I loved it, and there was not that that environment where Kentucky had to show its superiority constantly. Right. They were preeminent, and you better not forget it.
Right.
That was kind of the general way, I thought, of the atmosphere. But that year, it was just about fun. We have a team, and they finished 14-14.
That's incredible. Think about it. They lost 14 games, and the people were having fun.
Yeah, they had just fun. They had 14-14 is like a catastrophe.
Oh,
usually.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Well, one loss is a catastrophe. Well, 14 of them.
Absolutely. But they, that year it was fun. I enjoyed it too, in a sense that I fed off that fan enjoyment.
Well, they were shooting threes and running, and they had some Kentucky natives on the team. And again, Pitino brought all this to Lexington. What was he like for you to cover that first year, especially in light of the fact that you had that meeting at the restaurant when he was still a candidate?
Yeah, I don't remember any serious negativity after that. I would guess he didn't like the story. But, he got the job, and, I didn't keep bringing up the story again and again.
Right.
We wrote it. It was news, and it was dealt with, I guess, UK, and okay, move on. I wasn't trying to prevent anyone from being hired. It was just a news event. I mean, I didn't dwell on it. Wrote the story and then moved on. I was looking for the next story.
Well, he handled it professionally and not personally,
it
sounds like. And that's really all you need as a reporter, right? You're not looking to make friends or,
right.
You're just trying to have a working relationship with somebody you got to cover on a day-to-day basis.
Right. Yeah, true. True or false was what more I was concerned with, not helpful or unhelpful. That was not my agenda. I mean, if a story is helpful, good. It's fine. Either way, helpful or unhelpful, that's not a consideration.
Why do you think that team of Pelfrey, Feldhouse, Farmer, Woods, Mashburn, why were they so beloved then and now?
Well, as you mentioned, several of them are from Kentucky. And that's something that enshrines a player, especially if he's productive as a player, then he becomes an automatic fan favorite. But I think the sweep of their time, going from NCAA probation, and I remember going into 89-90, Kaywood Letford, the iconic radio play-by-play guy, said he didn't think they'd win 10 games. I think he said he thought they'd win about 8 games, which was, and then so 14 looked really good. I think that was one factor that contributed to 14 and 14 being pretty good.
Right.
But just that sweep of going from that. Then the next year, if I remember right, they had the best record in the SEC, but they were not eligible to win the championship, so they didn't win it. And then the next year, they had that great team and I think they won the SEC and go to the region finals and lose to Christian Laettner in maybe what some people think was the best game, most riveting college basketball game in history. So it's just the sweep there.
Like the Shakespearean drama of even how it ended.
Yeah, tremendous.
It ended in disappointment, but it ended in maybe the greatest, most unforgettable way for college basketball fans.
Yeah, I mean, it just would, even the most nonchalant fan, which I'm not sure Kentucky has any of those, would have been riveted by that Laettner game. It was just such a great game, and it was almost the perfect explanation point on those Kentucky players, except for losing, of course, for their time going what they accomplished over their college careers.
We touched on the Laettner game in your previous visit, and I'm still endlessly fascinated by that game because I was not there. You were in the Spectrum in Philadelphia. What was the atmosphere like during the game and then when Laettner makes the shot?
Well, that was, I did a separate chapter in the memoir just on the Laettner game. And, of course, I think Duke was number one and, a defending champ. And so they were sort of, if you would allow the possibility of a team supplanting Kentucky as preeminent, Duke had it. So you would add that to, your region final, going to the Final Four. And I remember, I think the statue of Rocky Balboa in Philadelphia. And so it just added up to this, it was too much for me. It was just like trying to comprehend this. And I always tried to not get caught up emotionally, but it was very hard not to, if not impossible in that game, just because of just the storyline. And of course, like we said a moment ago, just the 3-year buildup to this moment, which I've second guessed that since then about,
Yeah, you mentioned that before, that you look at it like maybe I didn't comprehend it as being as historic as it was.
I just treated it as this magnificent game. And with the Final Four in line, decided by a last-second shot by a guy that didn't miss a shot the whole game. And just was totally blown away. Maybe I said that on our earlier podcast.
Yeah.
Just blown away by it, just feeling inadequate. My insecurity was showing. And
your anxiety, once again, it always gets back to anxiety.
Yeah, what can I say? That's one of my faults, I guess.
Well, you said it's about witnessing history sometimes, and that was definitely a moment that was historic. But there have been other moments too, and I think about the guy that followed Pitino, Tubby Smith. Tubby comes into Kentucky as the first black head coach of the Wildcats.
And Kentucky had this history, and race had been such a big issue. When you think about the 1966 NCAA championship game when Adolph Rupp was the coach, and it was all-white Kentucky losing to an all-black starting lineup, Texas Western.
Right.
So there was all this context and history. How was that handled? How was the topic of race handled when Tubby took the head coaching position at Kentucky?
I don't remember it being a big issue. And just, I don't know. That's another thing that could be second guessed. I don't remember doing a story per se on that. He had been an assistant for Rick Pitino. So, there was a logic to it. He knew Kentucky. He had some familiarity with Kentucky basketball. And he had done a good job as a head coach. Mm-hmm. And he was at Georgia at the time that Kentucky hired him. So it added up and made sense, and race was obvious, So I don't remember it being a big issue. And I don't know. I remember when they did win it in 97, 98, his first year, the national championship, it was brought up that, he won it with players that were trained by Pitino. And so
it's always the problem that the guy who inherits a team doesn't seem to get the credit for taking that team, to a championship.
And you could wonder if race was a factor in that, because I remember I get into that somewhat in the memoir also.
Right.
And he didn't make an issue of it that I remember, and I just thought of him as a gentleman and a good coach who was doing a good job.
Sometimes you get a guy who's the right guy at the right time. And it seemed like Tubby fit that for a while until people said, he doesn't play fast enough.
Well, there's always something,
ball.
I think, especially when the fans are so into it, that after a certain amount of time, I've always thought, maybe I said this before, that coaches are like toys, that after a certain amount of time, the fans want a new toy to play with.
Pete Gillen, the old Xavier coach, once told me that coaches should leave after about 7 years. That's kind of the shelf life, and then people just get tired of you, even if you're winning. So maybe sometimes, maybe that's true sometimes.
Well, Tubby was here 10 years. I believe that's right, and did a great job.
Did you like covering Tubby?
Yeah, I thought he was a gentleman, and I felt like you could have a professional relationship with him. Mm-hmm. And, I could approach him and, I didn't have to just stick with just the press conference. There were times that I'd like to get him aside and I could ask him a question after he left the podium, stuff like that. Right. And I tried not to abuse it.
Right. But, there are times when you feel like it's the right time for that,
maybe there was a question or two that I didn't want everyone to hear, something like that.
Right.
So.
Right.
And, you felt like you could do that. You felt like, if he could, he would. It wasn't like his priority was outweighed yours, so don't even approach me.
Yeah, Tubby struck me from afar as not having an agenda that some coaches seem to have as much, I mean, there's a built-in agenda when you're the Kentucky coach or a high state football or Alabama football or any big giant program, but it seemed like it wasn't he wasn't pushing himself out there.
Well, the way I thought of it was that the other person mattered too. It wasn't just the coach. It wasn't just Tubby that had an agenda, that had things he had to do, blah, blah, blah. The other person did too. And so if he could be helpful with the other person, then he would. And, I thought that was, I don't know how rare a quality that is in coaching, but it's, I think it's a nice thing. And I've interacted with other coaches where you felt like, it wasn't just about the coach.
Well, let's talk about some other coaches, because not only Kentucky basketball, but you saw quite a list of characters during your time that came through the SEC. Guys like Hugh Durham, Dale Brown, who I mentioned, Wimp Sanderson at Alabama. I remember Wimp had the plaid jackets Do you have some favorites, opposing coaches that you encountered over the years that come to mind, in any anecdotes or encounters with them that stick out?
Hugh Durham had a sense of humor, and he kind of had a lighthearted approach to it. And I remember he coined the phrase "blue mist."
Blue mist, like the mist in the air?
A blue mist in the air, especially in Rupp Arena. And this mist could affect people, like those people in striped shirts that make calls during a game. And he the way he said it was that, there was a game where, at Rupp, and if the ball went out of bounds and it was Georgia's ball, the referee would just make the call, Georgia ball. But if the ball went out of bounds and it was Kentucky's ball, the referee would get really excited and get wound up. And, whoa, really, he's theatrical in making that call. And
didn't he once say that Don Rutledge, the SEC ref, the ball went out of bounds and Don pointed down to the court, down the other end of the court, and said, "Our ball."
I don't remember that, but I remember him. This wasn't I don't think this was at Georgia, although it may have been when he was Georgia coach, that a referee asked him, he didn't say who it was. The referees wanted a ticket for his mistress. And so Durham, now I don't know if this is true, but this is the story he told. And so they got him a ticket, the ref a ticket for his mistress. So during the game, Hugh is complaining about calls, and the referee goes over to him and objects to him questioning his integrity. And that was funny. I don't know, I don't know if that was literally true or just a nice way to make a point.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Dale Brown was another guy. He was funny, but he also got under the skin of Kentucky fans. And he stuck it to Kentucky sometimes in that that game where they beat Eddie Sutton's first team, a really good team in the regional final. Dale was quite a character too, right? Yeah,
he was really into it. You know what I mean? I think my guess is, well, one, he had success against Kentucky. Two, he enjoyed having success against Kentucky. And three, he really tried. You could tell he was into it, wanting to beat Kentucky, which none of that goes over well with the fans.
Right.
And he did a great job.
Yeah, at LSU. Yeah, he kind of he pointed to Kentucky as that's the standard. Yeah. That's what we have to achieve.
And he had moments of achievement. I think they beat Kentucky, I want to say like 74-51, something like that, in Rupp. It might be, I don't know if it is, but it might be the worst loss Kentucky's ever had in Rupp Arena.
Actually was there for that game. So we're bringing up all kinds of negativity.
Well, then there's also that first year, I believe this is right, with Pitino, they beat LSU, and LSU had Shaquille O'Neal and Stanley Roberts, and Chris Jackson.
And Chris Jackson.
I mean, they were, they were national championship good. They didn't win it, but they were good enough to win it. And Kentucky, with this makeshift team, beats them.
Right. That was like a huge landmark in the comeback of Kentucky's program. You were also there that night that LSU had a 31-point lead on Kentucky with 17 minutes to go. Their team rained down threes and wipe out a 31-point deficit to beat LSU at LSU.
Well, that game was in, as I remember, February, right around Mardi Gras time, and it was dubbed the Mardi Gras Miracle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I remember that year, and I think I get into this in the memoir. That year, with the Kentucky media, we got into this thing where if you thought the game was over, you lifted your hand and put it down. Like, okay, close the book. It's over. Okay. And everybody else, when LSU was up 31, put their hands down. The game was over. I didn't.
Oh, you did not. Let the record show. Okay.
Not because I'm smarter or anything. I just thought, like you said, with the 3-point goal, and Kentucky shot a lot of threes, they happened to make a bunch. All of a sudden, it's going to be game on, and LSU probably will feel pressure since they had the big lead. Is it going to get away?
Right.
And Pitino sat quietly on the bench. It looked like his body language said he'd given up.
Oh, he would never admit that.
No, probably not. But the players were still into it, led by, as I recall, Travis Ford. He was very animated in huddles on the court. And lo and behold, they make a bunch of threes, get back in the game, and then they ended up winning it. And I believe, I don't know if it's the largest comeback ever on the road or maybe largest comeback ever from a second half deficit. But yeah, it was historic for sure.
How challenging was that on deadline as a newspaper reporter?
Back then, I don't remember the deadline being that pressing. I may be wrong, but I don't remember it being that bad.
Right.
And I mean, it was also, of course, very memorable, and it was exciting. And I felt good about not putting my hand down. So it was a fairly pleasurable experience.
That's great. Let the Kentucky fans know that Jerry Tipton did not put his hand down that night. Well, you're there for the Mardi Gras miracle, and you're talking about other coaches in the SEC like Dale Brown of LSU, Hugh Durham. And my point is you saw these other great players, and you also saw so many great Kentucky players. So your beat really kind of grew, and it grew into this thing called Sunday Notes.
Right.
And I know you write about it in your memoir, Deja Blue. Sunday Notes were a thing that the Boston Globe was known for back in the 70s and 80s. And then all of a sudden, you started doing it in the Herald-Leader, and you were doing these long, in-depth Sunday Notes, even in the off-season, which really, to me, pointed out the insatiable hunger of Kentucky fans. How did that whole thing of Sunday Notes develop for you, and what did it mean for you as a journalist to do something besides just the daily news? Well,
I should point out, growing up, I was a Celtic fan. So I was kind of, if I had access to the Boston Globe, that was a good thing. I wanted to read about the Celtics. Right. And so I noticed the notes columns and various sports, and I liked them. They were entertaining and, different from stories, quote unquote, but I enjoyed it. And then covering Kentucky back then, we flew to most away games. And, on weekend games, I'd be flying through Atlanta, and the Atlanta paper on Sunday had notes columns.
Right.
So I thought, and there was always a frustration then. You were limited, the space for the story to the space available in the paper. Yeah,
there was no internet, right? You couldn't just put it out there.
So you were always having leftover stuff that you could maybe get in another story, a future story. But, it was like day after day, leftover stuff. And I thought that Sunday Notebook would be a place to use that.
Right.
And so the editors did not warm up to it immediately. They just thought it was taking up space, and I think also they hadn't done that in Lexington, so it was something new and different, and so there was some hesitancy. But they allowed it, and it really helped me continue because it was a way to ease that frustration of stuff that you couldn't get in the regular story. Plus, it was kind of an avenue to have enterprise and kind of look-ups, kind of extend something that you thought could be developed into an interesting story, but not maybe a daily story. So I came to really cherish that. I really liked doing it. And initially I was worried, what about in the off season? It's July. How am I going to fill the space? It was like 65 inches to start with.
That's a lot of words.
Yeah,
in July
and sometimes long
for off-season coverage.
Yeah, but I discovered happily that there's no off switch on Kentucky basketball. It continues. The interest never wanes, and there's, to my surprise, and it kind of motivated me to work, to call people and try to think up ideas that could be developed into notes and stuff like that. So, So I liked it. I had to make sure that I didn't put my opinion in there, which wasn't that hard. But that was a cautionary thing also.
Like you said, the spotlight never was turned off. It was always on. And what I always found interesting about players or coaches at Kentucky is, some people thrive in that type of environment and others can't. When you think about all the great Kentucky basketball players you saw and covered over those 41 years, were there's maybe one or two that stand out in terms of just they got it, they understood it, they were able to handle it in a way that maybe they thrived in it.
Well, I tell you, I'm not covering now, but Reed Shepherd strikes me that way, a freshman on this year's team. Both his mother and father played for Kentucky. He grew up in Kentucky wanting to play for Kentucky, so I think he got it.
Right.
And he's a big fan favorite. I'm trying to think for a moment. They've had so many great players over the years.
I mean, the guys would come in with, with these legendary tales as recruits. Like a guy like Sam Bowie, for instance, comes in, and he was there when you were really just starting on the beat. He comes in with all this hype and attention, and a guy like Rex Chapman comes in the late 80s, or 86 or 87. They come in with these storylines and the whole state expecting things, and some guys handle it and some don't.
Those guys handled it. And, of course, my first 2 years covering were the 2 years Sam Bowie sat out.
When he was
had
injured.
A stress fracture. And then he finally played my third year, was his last year. And if he felt any pressure about that, it didn't show. Mm-hmm. But Rex, I always wondered, and he has a new book coming out, and I guess it's a memoir. And I think he gets into that part of it is being that iconic figure as a teenager.
Right.
Which
You're in the eye of a hurricane, basically.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. And as you know, I mean, I would think it's much worse now with the internet and social media. And I didn't look at that stuff as it pertained to me or to pertain to anybody, really. I just, it was like almost a distraction, and I didn't want that on my mind. At the beginning, if I felt like the story merited comment, I might look, and I did some, but then I thought, people, if they send me an email, I'll read it, but I wasn't going to go on social media searching for it.
Do you have a favorite old-fashioned letter or any type of reader response to you over the years, or a comment made to you that sticks out in your mind as almost like funny, even though it's like mean-spirited?
Well, one person, and I think this is in the memoir, didn't like a question I asked of a player. I forgot that the post-game press conferences could be accessed on social media.
Right.
And they could watch every question. And so I asked a player a question about his play not being very good and how he felt that impacted the game that Kentucky lost. And the fan wrote in, not happy about me. And he, how should I put this delicately? He questioned the size of my manhood. And I always tried to, respond to the reader as long as I could think of a polite way to do it.
Right.
But that one, I couldn't think of a way to politely acknowledge, the protest.
As we wrap this up here, do you have a favorite team to cover or a favorite player? Or, I'm sure you get that asked a lot, but I'm thinking about it as a journalist, as somebody who was working the beat and not just watching the team.
Well, going into every season, I would be wondering, I hope there's going to be a player or two that you can engage, and have a nice back and forth with. And that seemed to always happen for the most part. There was players that, that got it, so to speak.
Who were some of those guys?
Well, Jamal Mashburn was good. And,
really? Okay.
I'm trying to think. So like John Pelfrey was good. Sam Bowie was good. Kenny Walker was good.
And what do you mean by good? I mean, I know what you mean as a journalist, but if listeners hearing this, what do you mean by a player who's good?
I always wanted the interview to be more than question response. Like with that year with COVID when we were on Zoom so much,
right?
You couldn't do anything about it. It was question response for the most part. But I wanted to engage the person and have a conversation that hopefully there were quotable comments made during the conversation. But that's what I wanted. I wanted a conversation. And I wanted to talk to the person as well as the player. And in the stories, I wanted to at least try to show the person to some extent.
Yeah. To remind people that these are real people.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. And I talked to Sam Bowie for the memoir, and he was good. He was very human in our conversation, which I appreciated. But anyway, another favorite was for mine, and this was almost on a much more personal level, was Eric Daniels, I think his name was. He was a big guy. He wasn't that big. And they were shorthanded that year, and so he played center. He was about 6'8". And one thing he did, and he used a shot fake. He'd kind of throw up his arm like he was shooting, and then the defender would react, and he'd go with the other arm. And
old school.
Yes. And I had a buddy back in the 70s when I worked at the paper in Huntington, West Virginia, Chris Thompson, and we used to kid about arm fakes. We thought they were like comic props. That's, nobody's falling for that. But Eric Daniels made it work. It worked. And I really enjoyed that. I like cleverness in a player. And that, and he had to use cleverness. He wasn't going to just overpower the other team's big guy most of the time.
Yeah. That's what I mean. When you see so many players over the years, I mean, some stand out because of sheer talent, but, some are memorable for cleverness on the court or the way they handle things off the court and the way they engage with you as media members. So you just...
Sense of humor. That was always nice to see that on display. I remember Kellen Grady. Do you remember him as shooter?
I do not.
He played in, I think 21-22 was his last year. And he was a transfer portal guy. And his teammates, who were mostly freshmen, called him Granddad. And I remember asking him, what's it like at age 24 to be a grandfather? And he laughed. And, but he kind of went back into the, I'm trying to help the players and that. But it was nice. He played along.
Right. Well, this has been a fun conversation, as always, Jerry. And I'm really looking forward to the book, Deja Blue, A Sports Writer Reflects on 41 Seasons of Kentucky Basketball. I wonder, as one final question, if somebody said to you, what was it like to cover Kentucky basketball for 41 years? Is there one thing that comes to mind that maybe is a summation of what that is like?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is good fortune. I felt very lucky. Like I said, everybody wants to cover something that the readers, in my case, would be interested in. And, the thought crossed my mind that, there could be a lot of good reporters out there covering very well and writing riveting stories, but you're not aware of it, or not as many people are aware of it because, they're not into that team. It's not a major team, so to speak. So I felt lucky. When I covered Marshall for a year or two before I came to Lexington to cover Kentucky. And I thought I had a few moments there where, a clever line in a story or something like that, but nobody would ever know it other than the readers of the paper. So I felt, it was I felt lucky to be covering Kentucky, and it was challenging, and it motivated me to try to do the best I could do.
Well, you did it well enough to be in the College Basketball Writers Hall of Fame and Kentucky Journalism Hall of Fame and your alma mater, Marshall. So again, I really appreciate, the way you went about doing your job. You had a big impact on me and how I thought the job should be done. And I know the fans, even the times they were griping, they were just glad that you were actually asking the questions that they were interested in.
Yes, I heard
behind
that.
the scenes.
Yes.
At times.
Yes.
Well, thanks a lot. And I want to say to everybody, check out Deja Blue. A sports writer reflects on 41 seasons of Kentucky basketball. It'll be a great read, not just for Kentucky fans, but for any fan of college basketball. So, Jerry, thanks again.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. We have new episodes every other Wednesday. Subscribe and review us. 5 stars and I might buy you a beer. And check out the Press Box Access channel on YouTube. You'll see a wide variety of clips from interviews, such as Dave Kindred comparing Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus, or Peter King recalling his early days of covering Bill Parcells and Lawrence Taylor. You can also listen to entire episodes on that YouTube channel. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button. Hey, it's free. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And please spread the word to friends, family, and anyone who is interested in sports, journalism, and history. All are welcomed. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcasts. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Huffman, and our engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Bruce Martin, host of Pit Pass Indy. Each week, I go behind the scenes of the NTT IndyCar Series and introduce our listeners to the biggest stars of IndyCar, which features the Indianapolis 500 as its cornerstone event. The men and women that compete in IndyCar may be the bravest athletes in all of sport, as danger lurks around every corner. They are able to look danger in the eye without flinching. That is why the NTT IndyCar Series features the best racing on the planet. Join me every week as we talk to the stars of IndyCar, including the legends of the Indianapolis 500 on Pit Pass Indy from Evergreen Podcasts.